The snow was already past my ankles when Vivian Holt threw my coat at my feet. Like it was garbage. She didn't want touching her. Porch, take your babies and get out. I bent down as fast as I could with Ren against my chest, one arm still cradling her, and yanked the coat around my shoulders with my free hand, not even getting it fully on before Marcus pushed the door wider behind his mother. My boots were still by the entryway, and I shoved my feet into them half-laced, my hands too shaky and full of newborns to manage the rest. It wasn't enough. Not against a night that cold. Not against wind that cut through a coat that wasn't zipped and boots that weren't tied. But it was more than nothing. And in that moment, more than nothing was all I had time to grab. Vivian's voice cracked through the freezing air, sharp enough to wake the twins. Ren started crying first, her tiny face scrunched red against the cold. Cole followed a second later, his cry thinner, weaker. 10 days old and already learning that the world could turn on you without warning. I stood there on the frozen driveway of the house I had been living in for 2 years, holding 2 newborns against my chest, my coat hanging open over a thin nursing gown, boots half-laced and already filling with snow, watching my husband close the front door behind his mother. Without once looking back at me, Marcus didn't even flinch. That's the part that still sits wrong in my chest all this time later. Not the cold, not Vivian screaming. It was watching the man I married stand in the doorway of our home, warm light spilling out behind him, and choose to let the door shut on his own children, like we were something he'd already thrown away days ago. They thought I had nowhere else to go. They thought I was a struggling freelance designer, barely covering rent, dependent on the Holt family for every diaper, every meal, every breath of stability I had left. They had no idea who they were really standing in front of. My name is Sarah Marsh. 10 days before that night in the snow, I gave birth to twins in a hospital room where my husband checked his phone 43 times during 11 hours of labor. I counted. When you're lying there, gripping a rail with your body tearing itself open to bring 2 lives into the world, counting becomes the only thing that keeps your mind from splitting apart with the pain. 43 times. His screen lighting up his face while a nurse held my hand because he wasn't holding it. I told myself it was stress, new father nerves. I told myself a lot of things in those years because that's what you do. When you've built your entire adult life around a story, you need to be true. Here's the story you need to understand first, because none of what happened later makes sense without it. 3 years ago, I met Marcus Holt at a charity gala in Chicago. I was there representing a boutique design firm. At least that's what my business card said. What it didn't say was that the firm was mine. I had built it from nothing, starting with hand-drawn sketches, sold out of a rented studio apartment when I was 24, growing it into a name that high-end residential clients whispered about in rooms I wasn't even in. I designed under a professional alias, Lena Cross, a name I created back when I was terrified that if people knew a young woman with no formal architecture degree was behind the work, they'd stop taking me seriously. The alias became a kind of armor. Nobody in Marcus's world had ever connected Sarah Marsh, the quiet woman who showed up to family dinners in thrifted blazers, to Lena Cross, the designer whose waitlist stretched 18 months long. I never lied about my success. I simply never advertised it. There's a difference, even if the Holt family would spend the next 3 years refusing to see it. Growing up, money had always been a source of quiet humiliation in my house. My mother cleaned offices at night and sewed alterations during the day to keep us afloat after my father left. I remembered with a clarity that never faded the particular way certain relatives used to look at her second-hand coat, her worn shoes, the careful way she counted change at the grocery store. I promised myself young that I would build something So solid nobody could ever look at me that way again. I just never imagined that the version of success I built would end up being the very thing I hid from the man I married. Because some old wound in me still equated being loved with being unworthy, regardless of what I had. That wound was exactly what the Holt family found and pressed on, again and again, without ever knowing they were doing it. Marcus was charming that night at the gala, attentive in a way that felt like sunlight after years of cold client meetings and solitary work nights. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He made me laugh so hard that a caterer asked us to quiet down. I fell for him slowly, the way you fall into a warm bath without noticing the water rising past your shoulders. I didn't correct him when he assumed my modest wardrobe meant modest earnings. Some small, quiet part of me liked being loved without my success attached to it. I wanted to know if Marcus Holt would have chosen me, even if I had nothing. I got my answer. It just took 3 years and 2 newborns to arrive. Vivian never liked me. That part was obvious from our very first dinner. When she looked at my department store dress and said, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "Well, Marcus certainly doesn't choose women for their bank accounts, does he?" I laughed it off then. I laugh a lot less about it now. Vivian ran the Holt family like a corporation with herself as permanent chairwoman. Marcus's late father had left behind a modest fortune and a struggling boutique, hospitality business, 3 small inns scattered across 2 states that Vivian had been trying to keep afloat for a decade through sheer stubbornness and a series of increasingly desperate loans. She adored appearances, she adored control, and she had decided within the first month of meeting me that I was a woman marrying up, a woman who needed to be managed, watched, and eventually removed once she'd served whatever purpose Vivian imagined I served. I didn't fight her for a place in that family. I simply built my life quietly alongside theirs, working from a converted sunroom in the house Marcus and I bought together, a house that on paper was listed under both our names, but that I had contributed nearly 70% of the down payment toward. Using savings I never disclosed the source of. Marcus knew I had some money saved. He never asked how much. I never told him. Looking back, that silence was an intimacy. 2 people building a marriage on separate, unshared truths. And truths that go unshared long enough eventually curdle into something else entirely. The pregnancy was hard. Twins are hard on anybody, and mine fought me through all 36 weeks I carried them. Marcus grew distant, almost the moment the second line appeared on the test. I told myself it was fear. I made excuses for the late nights at the office, for the phone he started keeping face down on every surface, for the way he stopped reaching, for me in bed months before I ever got too big to be held. I should have paid closer attention to a woman named Amber Page. Amber worked at Marcus's firm, a marketing associate with a laugh that carried across, open plan offices, and a habit of just checking in with my husband on weekends when I was elbow deep in nursery pain and 3rd trimester exhaustion. I met her twice at company events. Both times Marcus introduced her the same overly casual way. "This is Amber. She's on my team." The kind of introduction a man gives when he's rehearsed how casual it needs to sound. I didn't know yet. I want to be honest about that. Because this isn't a story where I was some brilliant detective, piecing together clues from the beginning. I was a very pregnant, very tired woman, trying to build a nursery and keep a company running from a laptop, balanced on my swollen knees. I missed things, or maybe some part of me chose not to look too closely, the way you avoid touching a bruise, because you already know how much it will hurt. The twins came 3 days early in the middle of a Tuesday snowstorm. 11 hours of labor that left me hollowed out and stitched together, holding 2 impossibly small humans who were, for one exhausted, tear-soaked moment, the only thing that mattered in the entire world. Cole came first, quiet and watchful, even as a newborn. Ren followed 4 minutes later, already furious at the cold hospital air, her cry filling the room in a way that made a nurse laugh and say she'd be running the household by age 3. Marcus held them both. He cried, actually cried, and for a moment I let myself believe that whatever distance had grown between us over the pregnancy would close now that our children were here. Breathing, real, hours old. I was wrong. It closed for exactly 10 days. 10 days is not very long. It's barely enough time for a newborn's umbilical stump to fall away. Barely enough time for a mother's body to remember how to function on interrupted sleep. It was apparently exactly enough time for Marcus and his mother to finish planning what came next. I noticed a shift on day 7. Vivian started arriving at the house daily, always with some excuse, lingering in the kitchen with Marcus in hushed conversations that stopped the second I walked in. I chalked it up to grandmother enthusiasm. On day 9, I found a text on the shared family tablet we kept for grocery lists. A message from Amber to Marcus that had synced across devices by some careless setting neither of us had thought to check. It wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. Almost there. Once she's out, we can finally stop hiding this. I read it standing in the nursery at 4 in the morning, Ren asleep against my shoulder. My whole body suddenly colder than the room actually was. I confronted Marcus the next morning, quietly, exhausted, holding Cole while he fed from a bottle because my body had nothing left to give at that point. He didn't deny it the way a guilty but repentant man might. He looked at me with something close to relief, like I'd finally said out loud what he'd been too much of a coward to say himself. This isn't working, Sarah. It hasn't for a long time. I think it's better if we're honest about that now, before things get more complicated. More complicated. As if 2 10-day-old infants weren't already the most complicated, precious thing either of us would ever be responsible for. I sat there in stunned silence, holding our son, while my husband explained in a calm, rehearsed voice that he and Amber had been involved for the better part of a year, that he'd been planning to tell me once things settled, and that his mother agreed it would be best for everyone if I took some time to figure things out somewhere else. Somewhere else. As though a woman 10 days postpartum with 2 newborns simply had a backup home, waiting in the wings. They assumed I didn't. That was their first mistake. Vivian arrived at 6 that evening, ostensibly to help with the babies, though I understood by then that her visits had never really been about the twins. She swept through the front door with the particular energy of a woman who had been waiting for this moment, settled onto the couch like she owned the house, and looked at me with a smile that wasn't kind. This arrangement clearly isn't sustainable. It's not working. Everyone can see that. And frankly, dear, it would be better for the children to have stability now, rather than growing up in a house full of tension. I asked, very simply, where exactly she thought I was supposed to take that stability, since I had no family in the state, no immediate income she was aware of, and 2 infants who needed round-the-clock care. You'll figure something out. You always do, don't you? Working from that little sunroom of yours. You've clearly gotten by before Marcus. I'm sure you'll manage. The way she said little made my skin crawl. I looked at Marcus, standing near the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing, not defending me, not defending our children's right to a stable home their mother had built with her own money. Just standing there, letting his mother do the work of ending my marriage for him. The same way he'd let a nurse hold my hand during labor while he checked his phone. It happened just before 9 that night. I had gone upstairs to feed the twins when I heard raised voices below. When I came back down, Vivian was standing by the front door, holding my coat, my hospital discharge bag, and a stack of baby items she had apparently packed herself. I think it's best you go stay somewhere tonight. Clear your head. Let Marcus and I sort out the practical details. I told her I wasn't leaving my home at 9 o'clock at night with 2 newborns in the middle of a snowstorm. That's when her voice broke into the scream. Take your babies and get out. I looked at Marcus. I actually looked directly at him, waiting. Some small foolish part of me, still hoping for him to step forward and tell his mother to stop, to tell me to sit down, to acknowledge that whatever had broken between us didn't mean our children deserved to be thrown into a snowstorm. He didn't move. He looked at the floor. Then he opened the front door himself. For a few seconds on that driveway, I couldn't move at all. My body was still recovering from labor, every stitch inside me screaming with the effort of simply standing upright. The wind cut through the thin cotton of my gown, like it had personal business with my bones. Wren's cry rose into something raw and frantic, and I pressed my lips to the top of her head, whispering the only thing I could think to say, over and over, half to her and half to myself. We're okay. We're okay. We're okay. I didn't believe it yet. I said it anyway. Because a newborn can't hear despair, and a mother can't afford to let it show, even when despair is the only honest thing in her chest. I looked back once at the house, at the porch light glowing gold against the snow, at the shape of Marcus's shadow, retreating from the window, and something inside me went very quiet and very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes solid. They think this is the end of something for me. They had absolutely no idea it was the beginning. I didn't call a shelter that night. I didn't call a friend to come rescue me sobbing on their doorstep. I called my company's emergency driver line, the car service my own firm retained for late client meetings. Within 11 minutes, a black SUV pulled into that driveway. My assistant, Rosa, had a room at a hotel booked and heated bottles, ready by the time I arrived, because I had texted her the second I stepped off that porch, and Rosa didn't ask a single question before she started making calls. I want to be very clear about something here. I was never broke. I was never without options. I had simply spent 3 years choosing not to reveal the full truth of who I was and what I had built. Because I wanted a marriage where I wasn't valued for a bank balance. That choice had cost me the ability to be seen clearly by the 2 people who were about to learn exactly who they had thrown into the snow. By midnight, wrapped in a hotel robe with both twins finally settled and sleeping, I opened my laptop and did the one thing I had avoided doing for 3 years. I told the truth. The first call went to my lawyer, Elena Vance, a sharp, unflappable woman who had handled my company's contracts since the beginning. I explained everything: the house, the down payment records under my real name, the marriage, the affair, the screaming in the snow. Elena listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said something I'll never forget. Sarah, you own 70% equity in that house through documented transfers. You have 3 years of bank statements proving independent income exceeding anything Marcus has ever earned. And you have a text message admitting to premeditated infidelity timed around your childbirth. This isn't complicated. This is going to be very, very clean. The second call went to my company's PR director, Danny Cole, a young, ferociously loyal woman who had been asking me for 2 years to let the industry know that Lena Cross and Sarah Marsh were the same person. It's a story, Sarah, she'd said more than once. A good one. People love finding out the quiet woman in the corner is actually the one running the room. That night, for the first time, I told her to run it, not out of spite. I want to be honest about my own motivations here. I wasn't doing this to destroy Marcus for the sake of destruction. I was doing it because I finally understood that hiding my success had never protected my marriage. It had only protected Marcus and Vivian's ability to underestimate me. An underestimation I was learning fast is a very dangerous thing to hand people who already think poorly of you. There was a practical side to going public that I didn't fully appreciate until Danny raised it. Any firm my size runs a standing conflict of interest review whenever a founder's name becomes public in connection with legal or reputational trouble. Routine risk management. Danny's team pulled the active contract list within the week, cross-referencing every client against the Holt name out of standard caution, nothing more. That's how we found it. Vivian's business manager had signed with my firm nearly a year earlier, through a referral from another hospitality client we'd worked with. An ordinary way for contracts to land in a luxury design market that's smaller and more interconnected than people assume. Nobody on my end had made the connection before then. Because I never reviewed client rosters personally at that scale, and Vivian's manager had signed the deal without her ever once asking who was actually behind the firm's name. The piece Danny published, in a well-read industry outlet, didn't name Marcus or Vivian directly, but it didn't need to. Anyone in their social circle who read it understood exactly who the estranged husband and controlling mother-in-law, mentioned in careful, lawyer-approved language, actually were. Elena moved quickly on the legal front. Within 4 days, she secured an emergency temporary order, granting me exclusive use of the home. Courts move fast when infants are involved, and a parent has documentation showing they were removed from a residence without safety or care arranged. Because the house deed reflected my documented financial contribution far more heavily than Marcus's, and because courts take a firm view on primary caregivers of infants being unlawfully removed from a shared residence, the temporary order held through the full proceedings and eventually became permanent. Marcus fought it briefly, with the kind of energy men display when they've never once had to fight for anything in their lives and don't know how to sustain it. His lawyer argued the house was marital property. Elena calmly produced 3 years of wire transfer records, showing my independent contribution alongside a forensic accountant's report, showing that during the same period, Marcus's contributions to household expenses had steadily declined while unexplained withdrawals, later traced to a rented apartment leased under Amber Page's name, had steadily increased. The affair, once merely implied, surfaced gradually through those same financial filings until it existed in the case record whether anyone wanted it there or not. Vivian's reaction deserves its own mention because it tells you everything about who she really was underneath the polished appearances she'd spent a decade curating. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften. Instead, she attempted to rally what remained of the family's social circle against me, telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated my way into their family, that I had hidden my wealth like some kind of con artist working an angle. She miscalculated badly, because by then, the story circulating wasn't about a con artist. It was about a mother pushed into the snow with newborn twins by a husband's betrayal and a mother-in-law's cruelty, and design clients, as it turns out, cared deeply about the character of the person redesigning their $1 million homes, 3 of Vivian's hospitality properties. The very ones she'd spent a decade struggling to keep solvent had recently signed contracts with my firm for a planned renovation meant to save the failing business. The same contract Danny's team had flagged during their routine review. I let my legal team quietly and professionally exercise the contract's standard morality clause the week. The affair became part of the public case record. The renovation contracts were terminated. Vivian's inns, already drowning in debt, lost the exact financial lifeline that project represented. I didn't gloat. I didn't send a single message. I simply let the paperwork speak, the way she had once let a slammed door speak for her. None of this came without cost to me, and I think it's important to say that plainly. rather than let this sound like a clean victory lap. Some of Marcus's extended family sided with him publicly, calling me calculating for going public at all. A handful of prospective clients quietly backed away, worried about their own privacy by association. Legal fees ran high enough that I dipped into savings I'd built for years without touching, and there were nights, plenty of them, when I sat awake with a crying infant on each side of me and felt nothing like a woman winning anything, just a woman surviving one more exhausting hour of a fight she never asked to be in. The custody arrangement, when it finally settled, gave me primary residence with the twins. Marcus's visitation started fully supervised. Standard, Elena explained. Whenever a court sees this much instability and this little established routine between a father and infants in the earliest weeks of their lives, regardless of fault, over the following year, as Marcus showed up consistently and completed the parenting classes the court required, the supervision gradually lifted. I won't pretend that didn't complicate the clean, satisfying ending I might have wanted. Co-parenting with a man who broke your family apart is its own particular kind of exhausting. One that doesn't end just because the court case does. I moved back into the house in early spring, the same driveway where I had once stood freezing with 2 newborns, was now edged with the first stubborn crocuses pushing up through the last of the snow. I stood there for a long moment on the day I got the keys back, Cole strapped to my chest, Ren napping in her stroller, and I let myself finally fully cry. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief. Marcus reached out eventually, months later, in a message that read more like a man mourning what he'd lost than a man who understood why he lost it. He wrote that he never expected things to go this far, that he didn't realize how much he'd taken for granted. I responded with 4 words that felt more true than anything I could have shouted at him on that porch. You had every warning. He tried once more, weeks after that, showing up unannounced outside the office, where I now worked openly under my own name. No alias left to hide behind. He stood in the parking lot, looking smaller than I remembered, and asked quietly why I never told him the truth about who I was from the very beginning. I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered, because it deserved an honest response rather than a cutting one. I told you exactly who I was, Marcus, I said. You just decided a woman without much money was easier to love than a woman who didn't need you to survive. That was never my secret to carry. That was yours. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think he ever will. Amber and Marcus's relationship, from what I understand, through the small unavoidable overlap our lives still share because of the twins, didn't survive the fallout either. It's a strange thing, watching a relationship built on secrecy. Discover that secrecy doesn't disappear once it's served its purpose. It simply gets redirected toward whoever's convenient to blame next. Vivian never apologized. I've stopped waiting for her too, I heard, through the thin, unavoidable grapevine that still connects our lives. That Vivian eventually had to sell one of the 3 inns to cover the debt left behind, once my firm's contract dissolved, and restructure financing on the other 2 just to keep them from following it. She kept the business alive, technically, though her health started declining under the stress of watching a decade of careful appearances collapse in the span of a single season. I felt something when I heard that, though it wasn't triumph. Not exactly. It was closer to the quiet, sober satisfaction of watching consequence finally arrive at a door that had spent years believing it was exempt from ever answering for anything. I didn't call her. I didn't send flowers. And I didn't send judgment either. I simply let her situation exist the way mine had once been forced to exist on that driveway. Unsheltered, unassisted, entirely hers to survive. These days, my sunroom studio has expanded into a full office on the other side of the house. Walls covered in fabric samples and blueprints. My 2 children, old enough now to toddle between drafting tables, while Rosa tries valiantly to keep them from eating swatches of raw silk. Cole is quiet and watchful, just like he was the moment he was born. Wren still announces her opinions to the entire household the second something displeases her, and I have never once tried to tame that fire out of her. Some evenings, after both twins are finally bathed and fed and settled into heavy, boneless sleep, I sit alone in the sunroom where the second chapter of my life first took root, and I let myself simply breathe. The house is quiet in a way it never was during those last strained months with Marcus. That old quiet was the sound of a woman shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's comfort. This quiet is the sound of a woman who finally stopped apologizing for the size of the life she built. I think about that night often, not with the sharp sting it once carried, but with a strange kind of clarity. Vivian and Marcus looked at a woman holding 2 newborns in the snow and saw someone with nothing. They saw someone they could discard without consequence because they had already decided, long before that night, exactly how little I was worth. They were wrong about almost everything that mattered, and the ground they pushed me into that night turned out to be exactly where I finally planted something that grew strong enough to outlast every single thing they thought they were protecting. So, here's what I keep coming back to, and what I want to ask you directly, because I think it says something true about how easily people mistake quiet for weak and modest for empty. If someone you loved decided you had nothing left to lose, would you let them believe that? Or would you show them exactly how wrong they were?